It was a hot afternoon in the small town of Maple Creek. The sun was shining brightly, and the streets were unusually quiet. In the town's local park, a young black girl named Jasmine sat on a bench, her hands tightly gripping her notebook. She was an aspiring artist, always sketching in her free time, escaping into the world of her imagination. Today, however, she felt uneasy. She didn't know why, but something about the day felt off. Nearby, Officer Blake, a man known for his harshness and quick temper, was patrolling the park. He walked with a sense of power, like he owned the place. People avoided him, knowing that if you crossed him, you could end up in trouble. Blake had a reputation for being rough with people, especially when he thought they were breaking the rules. Most of the time, he got away with it. Today, Jasmine was about to be his next target. Blake walked up to Jasmine, his boots heavy on the ground. She looked up, feeling a shiver run down her spine. He was tall and broad, with an expression that never seemed to soften. His eyes scanned her as if searching for something to punish. Jasmine had been sitting peacefully, but he didn't seem to care. He made up an excuse, claiming that she was sitting too close to the sidewalk, a violation of some rule no one had ever heard of before. "You're not allowed to sit here," Officer Blake said, his voice sharp. Jasmine was confused. She had been coming to this park for years, and no one had ever told her where she could sit. But she didn't argue. She stood up quickly, trying to avoid making the situation worse. However, Blake wasn't done. "I said you're not allowed to sit here," he repeated, stepping closer. Jasmine's heart began to race. She didn't want trouble, but she felt something was wrong. Blake pulled out a pair of clippers from his belt and started walking toward her. Jasmine froze, her eyes wide in shock. "You're gonna need to get that hair fixed," he sneered, pointing at her long braided hair. Jasmine tried to back away, her hands shaking. "You're too much of a distraction, and I can't have that around here." Jasmine wanted to scream, to run, but she was frozen. She couldn't understand why he was doing this. It wasn't even about the park anymore. It was about something deeper, something cruel. Blake's eyes showed no kindness as he took a step forward. He grabbed a section of her hair and started cutting. Jasmine's eyes filled with tears, but she couldn't make a sound. The buzzing of the clippers filled the air, and she felt each lock of hair fall to the ground. The humiliation was unbearable, and yet she said nothing. She wanted to fight back, but she knew how dangerous that could be with someone like Officer Blake. She was powerless. Finally, after what seemed like forever, Blake stepped back, pleased with his work. Jasmine stood there, speechless, looking at the pile of her beautiful hair at her feet. The officer walked away, satisfied, leaving Jasmine in stunned silence. Little did he know, he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Jasmine wasn't just any girl. She was someone far more important than he realized. Officer Blake had always carried himself with an air of authority. He was the type of man who believed that his uniform gave him power over others. Born and raised in Maple Creek, he grew up in a small house on the outskirts of town, a place where people often said things were tough. He had learned early on that the world could be harsh, and the best way to survive was to stand tall and take control. His father, also an officer, had taught him the importance of discipline and respect for authority. However, Blake had taken these lessons to an extreme. He believed that rules were not just guidelines, but things that had to be enforced with force. He had risen quickly through the ranks of the police force, earning a reputation for being a man who got things done, no matter how harsh the methods. Blake wasn't known for his kindness. Many people in Maple Creek spoke in hushed tones about him. They said he didn't care much for the law, only for enforcing his own version of it. To him, anyone who looked at him the wrong way or questioned his authority was a target. And those who didn't stand up for themselves, like Jasmine, were easy victims. He had been a good cop in the eyes of his superiors, even if he often used scare tactics to get results. He didn't care about being liked. What mattered to him was respect, and to get that, he believed he needed to make people fear him. No one ever challenged him, and that's how he liked it. He walked through life with a sense of superiority, convinced that he was untouchable. His colleagues respected him, but they also kept their distance. Blake had a way of making people feel small, even if they didn't deserve it. He believed in power, not compassion. It wasn't that he had never seen a softer side of life. He had. But he had buried it deep inside, choosing instead to focus on his career and the control he could have over others. People feared him, but no one truly liked him, and that suited him just fine. But Blake's confidence in his authority was about to be tested. What he didn't know was that, behind the scenes, someone was watching. Someone with the power to make him regret his actions. He had made a mistake by targeting the wrong person, a person with a family far more influential than he could ever imagine. The more Blake thought about the girl he had just humiliated, the more he convinced himself that she was just another person who needed to be taught a lesson. He didn't know her background or her family. To him, she was just another face in the crowd, no different from the others he had dealt with over the years. But little did he know, he had just crossed a line that would change his life forever. Blake's pride and confidence were about to come crashing down, and it would all start with the girl he had thought was nothing more than a target. He was in for a rude awakening, and he had no idea just how far his mistake would take him. Jasmine's family had always been protective of her. Her father, a man of great influence in the town, was someone many respected but few truly knew. He didn't seek the spotlight, but his reputation was built on years of hard work and helping others. He had always kept a low profile, preferring to stay out of the public eye. But behind the scenes, his name carried weight, and his connections were far-reaching. Her mother, a strong and caring woman, was the one who had raised Jasmine with love and discipline. She taught her daughter the importance of kindness and standing up for what's right, even when the world seemed unfair. Jasmine had always looked up to both of her parents. They had created a life for her that was peaceful and supportive, filled with love and respect. But they were also fiercely protective of their family, and they would go to great lengths to make sure no harm came their way. Jasmine's father had always told her to be careful, to watch who she trusted. He knew how the world worked, and while he had never been one to flaunt his power, he had always made sure his family was safe. He had worked his way to the top, building a network of people who looked up to him, not because of his wealth, but because of his integrity. His connections reached across various parts of the town, and even beyond, to places where others didn't dare to go. He knew how to handle himself in tough situations, always keeping his family's best interests at heart. Though he was a private man, those who knew him well understood the lengths he would go to protect his loved ones. His quiet strength was what made him such a force to be reckoned with. He didn't need to shout or make threats. His mere presence was enough to make people listen. When Jasmine came home that day, her mother immediately noticed something was wrong. Jasmine was quiet, too quiet, and her eyes were filled with a sadness her mother couldn't ignore. She sat down beside her daughter, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. Jasmine hesitated but finally told her mother everything that had happened. The humiliation, the cruel officer, the shaving of her hair. As Jasmine spoke, her mother's heart sank. She knew that something had to be done, and it had to be done quickly. Jasmine's father, when he heard the story, didn't say much at first. His face remained calm, but his eyes, sharp and focused, were already thinking about the next steps. He knew the officer. He had crossed paths with him before, but never had he seen him act so recklessly. Jasmine's father could feel his blood begin to boil, but he kept his emotions in check. This wasn't the time for anger. This was the time for action. Without saying a word, he began to make calls. His network of contacts, people who respected him and understood the value of his family, would be activated. He wasn't going to let this incident slide. Jasmine's father knew that Blake had crossed a line, and now it was time for the officer to realize just who he had wronged. As the phone calls continued, Jasmine sat quietly, trying to make sense of everything. She didn't understand the full extent of her father's power, but she trusted him. She knew that, whatever happened next, her family would be there for her, and that gave her a small sense of comfort. What she didn't know was that her father's plan was already set into motion. And soon, the officer would learn the hard way that Jasmine's family was not to be underestimated. The days after the incident were tough for Jasmine. Her emotions felt like a whirlwind, spinning out of control. She couldn't stop thinking about the humiliation, the feeling of helplessness when the officer had shaved her hair. The memories kept playing over and over in her mind, each time bringing a fresh wave of sadness and frustration. She had always been proud of her appearance, her hair being an important part of her identity. And now, it was gone, cut away by someone who had no right to take it from her. At home, Jasmine's mother noticed the change in her daughter immediately. Jasmine had always been a bright, outgoing girl, but now she seemed distant, withdrawn, as if the spark had been taken from her. Her mother was worried but didn't know how to help. She sat with Jasmine in the evenings, trying to comfort her, but words seemed to fall short. Jasmine couldn't express how she felt. All she knew was that her confidence had been shattered. Her father, too, saw the difference in his daughter. He was a man of few words, but his eyes always told the story. He could see the hurt in Jasmine's eyes, and it made him angry. He couldn't understand why someone would do something so cruel to his child. His protective instincts kicked in, and he knew that this was more than just a case of a mean officer abusing his power. It was personal now. That night, after dinner, Jasmine's father called his wife into the study. He didn't raise his voice, but there was a seriousness in his tone that made his wife sit up straighter. He had already made his decision. "I'll take care of this," he said calmly, though his mind was racing with plans and strategies. He wasn't going to let this go. The officer had made a mistake, and now he would pay for it. His wife nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. Jasmine's father had a network of people he had helped throughout the years. People who owed him favors, people who respected him. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about making sure something like this never happened again. He wasn't going to let Blake think he could get away with such actions. Jasmine's mother didn't argue. She knew that her husband was doing what was best for their family. They couldn't let this slide, not after what happened. But even as she agreed with her husband, she couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. She had always trusted that the law would protect them, but now she was seeing that not all officers used their power for good. This was a wake-up call, and it left her with a feeling she couldn't shake off. The next morning, Jasmine's father started making phone calls. One by one, he reached out to his contacts, explaining what had happened to Jasmine and what he intended to do about it. People listened, and soon the word started to spread. No one was going to let Officer Blake's actions go unnoticed. Jasmine's father's plan was already in motion, and he knew it wouldn't be long before Blake realized the mistake he had made. Meanwhile, Jasmine sat quietly in her room, unaware of the storm that was brewing around her. She just wanted things to go back to normal. She longed to feel like herself again. But little did she know, her father was about to ensure that justice would be served in a way that no one would forget. Jasmine's father sat in his study, his hands clasped together in deep thought. The anger he felt for what had happened to his daughter was burning inside him, but he knew that anger alone wouldn't bring about the right kind of change. He had to be smart, careful, and strategic. His thoughts were clear. He was going to make sure that Officer Blake faced the consequences of his actions, and he was going to do it in a way that would make people take notice. As a man of influence, Jasmine's father had connections, people in the town who respected him, people who trusted him. Over the years, he had built a reputation not just for his business success, but for his integrity and his willingness to help others. His network extended beyond Maple Creek, to people in places of power, and he had always been the one people turned to when they needed guidance or support. Now, it was time for his network to work for him, to make sure that his daughter's pain wasn't ignored. His first move was to contact a few key people, trusted allies who could help bring attention to what had happened. He didn't want to act out of anger. Instead, He planned to expose Blake's actions and make sure that the officer could no longer harm anyone else. His contacts promised to gather information, and the wheels of his plan slowly began to turn. The more people who knew about the incident, the harder it would be for Blake to escape the consequences. Jasmine's father also made sure to contact the town's mayor, someone he had known for years. They had a mutual respect for each other, and Jasmine's father knew that the mayor could be a powerful ally in this situation. The mayor was quick to understand the gravity of the situation and promised to support the cause. It wasn't just about one officer's behavior. It was about setting a precedent that no one, no matter their position, could abuse their power without facing the consequences. Meanwhile, Jasmine's mother remained by her side, comforting her as best as she could. She knew her husband was taking action, but she also understood that this wouldn't be a quick or easy process. Jasmine's mother was a patient woman, but she couldn't help feeling a sense of urgency. She didn't want her daughter to continue suffering in silence. She wanted to see justice, not just for Jasmine, but for anyone else who might be targeted by someone like Officer Blake. Jasmine, for her part, had no idea about the extent of her father's plans. She had always known that her father was a man of influence, but she didn't realize just how much power he truly held. She still felt humiliated, unsure if things would ever return to normal. She had tried to smile through the pain, but it was clear that the incident had left a mark on her. She wished it could all just go away. Her father, however, was determined that things would get better. He was a man who had always protected his family, and he wasn't about to stop now. He had promised himself that no matter what, he would make sure that Officer Blake paid for what he had done. He wasn't going to let his daughter's pain be forgotten or ignored. With his plan now set into motion, Jasmine's father felt a sense of calm. The storm was coming, and Officer Blake would soon understand just who he had wronged. Officer Blake sat at his desk, going through the usual paperwork. It was another long shift, and his mind was distracted. He couldn't stop thinking about the girl, Jasmine, and the incident that had taken place at the park a few days ago. He had never intended to cause such an uproar, but in his mind, he had done what needed to be done. She had broken a rule, and he had made sure she knew it. He couldn't understand why people were making such a big deal about something as simple as a haircut. Blake had always been confident in his position. He believed that, as an officer, his actions were justified, even if others didn't always agree with him. He was used to people being afraid of him, and in his mind, this was just another example of his authority being questioned. To him, it wasn't personal, it was just business. But as the days passed, he began to feel a strange unease that he couldn't shake. It started with the whispers. At first, they were small, quiet conversations in the hallway. People had been talking about the incident, and Blake could sense that the atmosphere around him had changed. His colleagues were looking at him differently, and some of them were even avoiding eye contact. It was subtle, but Blake could feel the shift. Then came the phone calls. Blake had received several messages from people he didn't recognize, all asking questions about what had happened that day in the park. Some of them were curious, others seemed more urgent. He tried to brush it off, telling himself that it was just the usual gossip. But then, one phone call caught his attention. It was from the mayor's office. Officer Blake, the voice on the other end said, "We need to have a talk." Blake's heart skipped a beat. The mayor rarely called him directly, and the tone of the conversation made it clear that this was serious. He felt a sudden knot form in his stomach. As the conversation continued, Blake's world began to unravel. The mayor asked him about the incident with Jasmine. At first, Blake tried to defend his actions, but the more the mayor pressed, the more Blake realized that this wasn't just about a simple rule being broken. Something much bigger was at play. It was then that Blake learned who Jasmine's father was. He had no idea that the girl he had humiliated was the daughter of one of the most influential figures in town. Her father's reputation was known across the region, not just for his business success, but for his integrity and the network of people who respected him. Jasmine's father was a man who didn't just have power. He had influence that stretched far beyond the small town of Maple Creek. The realization hit Blake hard. He had made a grave mistake. He had targeted the wrong person, and now he was going to pay for it. The mayor's voice became more serious as he explained the consequences Blake could face. His mind raced, and for the first time, Blake felt a wave of fear wash over him. He had always believed that he could control situations, that his position gave him the upper hand. But now, he saw how quickly things could turn against him. As the call ended, Blake sat back in his chair stunned. His arrogance had clouded his judgment, and now he had made an enemy of someone who could destroy his career. He had thought he was untouchable, but now he understood just how wrong he was. The officer was about to face the consequences of his actions, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As the days passed, the tension in Maple Creek grew thicker. Word of the incident with Officer Blake and Jasmine spread through the town like wildfire. People were shocked and appalled by what had happened, but there was also a sense of disbelief. Most had never imagined that something like this could happen in their quiet, peaceful town. The more they talked about it, the more the community began to question whether the officer had gone too far. Jasmine's father had been working quietly behind the scenes, making calls, meeting with his contacts, and organizing everything. He wasn't someone who acted impulsively, and he knew that the best way to handle the situation was with patience and precision. But with each passing day, he grew more anxious. He wasn't a man who liked to wait, especially when it came to his family. And Jasmine, though trying to remain strong, continued to struggle with the trauma of the incident. She tried to carry on with her life, but the weight of what had happened was always there, just beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Officer Blake's nerves were starting to get to him. After the call from the mayor, he couldn't stop thinking about the consequences he might face. He was used to being in control, used to having people fear him. But now, he could feel the eyes of the town on him. Every time he walked through the streets, he felt like people were whispering behind his back. His colleagues had started to distance themselves from him as well. They no longer spoke to him as they once had, and when they did, it was with a coldness that made him uneasy. Blake tried to put on a brave face, but deep down, he knew things weren't going to be the same. He had always prided himself on being a man who could handle anything, but now he felt like his whole world was crumbling. He had underestimated Jasmine's family, and now he was beginning to realize the gravity of his mistake. The more Blake thought about it, the more his mind raced. He wondered how far Jasmine's father was willing to go. What could he do? What kind of power did this man have? Blake had heard rumors about Jasmine's father being a well-respected figure, but he had never imagined he could be so powerful. It made Blake's heart race with fear. He had crossed a line, and now it was too late to take it back. Meanwhile, Jasmine's father continued to make moves in the background, carefully setting everything into place. He was calm, but there was a determination in his eyes that told those around him that he was serious. No one, not even the officer who had wronged his daughter, would escape the consequences of his actions. He wasn't doing this out of revenge. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do. The people in the town needed to see that no one, no matter their position, was above the law. As the pressure mounted on Officer Blake, he found himself questioning everything he had once believed. He had always thought that his badge gave him power, but now he was seeing that real power came from something far deeper: respect, integrity, and standing up for what's right. His arrogance had led him to this point, and now he was about to learn the hardest lesson of all. The tension in Maple Creek was reaching its peak, and soon Blake would find out just how far Jasmine's father was willing to go to protect his family. The day Blake had been dreading finally arrived. It started like any other day, with the usual rounds of paperwork and patrol duties, but the air around him felt different, tense, heavy. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something he wasn't ready for. His colleagues treated him with a cold politeness, but there was no warmth in their smiles anymore. Blake could feel the shift. No one looked at him the same way they used to. Around midday, Blake was called into the police chief's office. He had seen the chief more than a few times, but this felt different. The chief's face was serious, and Blake knew instantly that this wasn't a casual conversation. The room felt small, as if the walls were closing in on him. As Blake sat down across from the chief, he noticed a stack of papers on the desk, papers he didn't recognize. "Blake," the chief started, his voice calm but firm. "We've been made aware of some serious concerns regarding your actions during that incident with Jasmine at the park." Blake felt a knot form in his stomach. His hands, once steady, now felt clammy. He knew what this was about, but he couldn't bring himself to admit it. He had tried to justify his actions, tried to tell himself that he was in the right. But now, hearing the chief's words, it felt like everything was crashing down around him. "You've got some explaining to do, Blake," the chief continued. "There are people in this town, people who matter, who are not happy with your behavior. This goes beyond just a small mistake. This is about how you've treated a young girl and the impact it's had on her family, a family with influence." Blake's mind raced. He thought about Jasmine's father, the man whose name had been whispered in every corner of the town. He had learned just how powerful this man was. But it was too late now. The damage had already been done. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," Blake muttered, but the words sounded weak even to his own ears. The chief looked at him with a hard expression. "It doesn't matter what you meant, Blake. What matters is what you did. And now we have to make sure that this doesn't happen again." The conversation continued, but Blake barely heard the rest. His mind was spinning, trying to process what was happening. He had always believed that as an officer, he was untouchable. He had never imagined that a simple mistake could lead to his downfall. But now, with every word from the chief, he realized that he was about to lose everything: his job, his reputation, and his place in the town. Within hours, the news broke. The story of Jasmine's humiliation had spread far beyond Maple Creek, and people were talking. It wasn't just the townspeople who were outraged. The news had reached outside the small town, catching the attention of those who had the power to act. Blake was put on administrative leave pending an investigation, and it became clear that his career as an officer was over. The public outcry was loud and unforgiving. Blake spent the rest of the day in a daze, his thoughts consumed by the overwhelming consequences of his actions. He had thought that he could get away with it, that his badge and authority would shield him. But now he understood how wrong he had been. Jasmine's father had made sure that the truth was brought to light, and Blake was left to face the fallout of his own mistakes. By the end of the day, Blake knew that his life would never be the same. He had learned the hard way that no one, no matter how powerful they seemed, could escape the consequences of their actions forever, and Jasmine's family had made sure of that. The days following Officer Blake's downfall were filled with a mix of emotions for Jasmine and her family. They had won, but the journey had been difficult, and it wasn't one they could easily forget. Jasmine's hair had been cut away, and though it would grow back, the experience had left a deep mark on her. However, there was also a sense of peace in knowing that her father had ensured justice would be done. The officer had faced the consequences of his actions, and the community was beginning to heal. Jasmine's father, though still stern and focused, allowed himself a rare moment of relief. He had acted swiftly and decisively, and now the officer who had humiliated his daughter was no longer a threat. His plan had worked, but it hadn't been without cost. The whole ordeal had weighed heavily on his heart, and though he hadn't shown it to his family, he had been worried about how Jasmine would cope. His protective instincts had kicked in, but the true battle had been watching his daughter suffer. Jasmine's mother was relieved too, but she was also thankful for the support they had received. She had stood by her daughter's side through the entire process, and though she had been scared, she knew that Jasmine's strength was what had carried them all through. The family was closer than ever, united by the experience. Jasmine sat in her room one afternoon, looking out of the window. The sunlight filled the room, casting a warm glow on the walls. She was starting to heal, slowly but surely. Her father had kept his promise, and she was beginning to feel like herself again. Her hair would grow back, but what had mattered more was the way her family had come together to protect her. She had never felt more loved, and that in itself was a kind of victory. Her thoughts turned to the people in the town who had supported her family through it all. Word had spread about Officer Blake's actions, and many had stood by Jasmine, offering comfort and encouragement. It was in these moments that Jasmine realized how strong the community really was. While some people had feared the officer, they had also been the first to speak out when they saw something wrong. It made her believe that, even in the face of injustice, good people were ready to stand up for what was right. Her father had taught her that strength came not from power or authority, but from the heart. He had shown her that standing up for others was the most important thing you could do. Jasmine was proud of him, proud of how he had handled the situation with calm determination. He had been a rock for her, and now she understood the true depth of his love and protection. As time passed, the memories of the ordeal began to fade, but the lessons learned stayed with them all. Jasmine knew that life wasn't always fair, and that sometimes people in power made mistakes. But what mattered most was how you responded to those mistakes, and the strength you found in standing up for what was right. In the end, it wasn't just the officer's downfall that made a difference. It was the way Jasmine and her family had faced adversity together. They had overcome something difficult. And now, as a family, they were stronger for it. The town of Maple Creek would remember the incident, but more importantly, they would remember how Jasmine's family had shown them the true meaning of justice, love, and resilience.